Many of my friends have come out. I'll see people respond with, you can't be gay and Christian. Like it's an oxymoron. And that creates this, sense in which, God doesn't want gay people in the church. And it functions to push people away. Like, oh, I can't be a Christian? What's the conclusion that a lot of people are going to make? They're not going to even try, because all of these Christians are saying that actually God doesn't want them in the church. And so it's so harmful.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Word Made Digital podcast. Thanks for checking out the video version of the podcast here on YouTube. Of course, we've got the audio version as well if you want to check that out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. But we really hope that these conversations week after week inspire you, connect with you, maybe stir something up in you or teach you something that you haven't heard before. We've got a whole archive of podcasts right here on the YouTube channel, as well as a ton of tutorials to equip you really practically as a communicator, as a leader in the church, and as a creative. So I encourage you to check that out. Subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks so much to the sponsors, Compassion Canada and the Church Co, for making this season of the podcast possible. Bridget, welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm really honored to have you on the podcast today.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
When I saw the topic and the subject of a book you're just releasing, I thought, I need to talk to this woman, and more actually not talk to you. I really want to hear from you, and I want to give you an opportunity to share. And so I'll poke you with a few questions, but I hope to just hear from you. So the book that we're talking around, or the subject, is Heavy Burdens: 7 Ways LGBTQ Christians Experience Harm in the Church. So it's a huge topic, an important topic. So before we go any further, let's just introduce yourself. Maybe you can start just sharing some of your own story, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so my name is Bridget Eileen Rivera. Like you said, I have a book coming out called Heavy Burdens, and the book, I guess, it impacts the experiences of queer people in the church, specifically around discrimination and just how queer people have been treated. And I guess that book kind of started as a result of some of my own experiences in the church as a queer person, as well as the experiences of a lot of my friends. I guess I started coming out around 2013 when I was 23 years old. And it was a shocking experience to me, the response that I got from Christians. I had been raised in the conservative evangelical church my whole life, been very, very involved, had, in many ways been the quote unquote model Christian woman. And my faith had never been questioned. My sexual purity never questioned once. And when people started finding out that I was gay, it was just a whole different situation. All of a sudden, I was being called into accountability meetings, people asking about past sexual experiences that I may or may not have had, how I was responding to sexual temptation. It was like all of a sudden, everything in my life was revolving around sexual sin and sexual temptation. It was like this was the defining thing, and it was very shocking. Long lists of do's and don'ts. Being questioned for the most minute things in my life, like why do you sit next to your best friend in church? Like that being a suspicious thing, and. I sit next to my best friend in church because I'm a single woman and I don't have anyone else to sit next to. But
yeah, I guess I'm laughing because where did they want you to sit? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it was so shocking. It was so world paradigm shattering for me because I had never been treated that way. And I guess it opened up a whole new world for me. And I started talking to friends as I, got more involved in the queer Christian community, just learning shocking stories of just, really horrendous abusive situations of, people being fired from ministry, fired from, jobs with Christian organizations, not because of even having sex or anything, friends that were celibate, but just for being gay, just for it being found out that they were attracted to the same sex. It was really just shocking to me, because my perspective of Christians had been at the time that this was a historical thing. Christians' attitudes, it was, a thing of the past. And especially in my church, at least, people knew me. They knew who I was. They knew that I loved Jesus. And so if people found out this thing about me, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, especially if I was celibate, I believed, because, I'd be following the, traditional sexual ethic. And so, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But it was huge to people. And I guess it just really altered my perspective of the church and how it actually functions, and the impact that a lot of assumptions people have wind up having on queer people who love Jesus and yet are seen as these, kind of sinful pariahs by so many. So that's kind of, ultimately, I guess, the start of me thinking about a lot of these things and putting together the ideas for this book, Heavy Burdens, and just really wanting to see this narrative change, really wanting to see queer people not treated in this way, really to see queer people, seen in the church as just normal people like anyone else and not treated so differently. And so I guess that was the start of it for me.
Yeah. Well, there's so many things to jump off of from what you've just said. Thanks for sharing, this is like just a helpful intro into where you're coming from. But even just the idea that you're saying queer Christians or a queer Christian community, for some people listening, they wouldn't know that exists, or that doesn't sound like those things can go together. Because for a lot of people, if you come out, you leave the church. That's sort of like 1 + 1 1 + 1 equals exit.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that community. Like, this is a community of people. I don't know. Where did you meet this? Is it a community you found online or in your own neighborhood? Or tell me a little bit about the community that you're hearing these stories from yourself.
Yeah. So I am part of an online community of over 700 queer Christians who love Jesus and are queer, span the range of the LGBTQ spectrum, and are actually committed to being celibate or being married to the opposite sex and following the traditional teachings of the church when it comes to sexual ethics. That's really shocking to a lot of people, because a lot of Christians don't think that queer people would ever follow the traditional teachings of Scripture. It's kind of just it's just kind of assumed that if you are queer in any way, then you have rejected traditional teaching. And so that alone is often just, whoa, this exists. And yeah, it exists. And, the online community that I'm a part of is in the hundreds. And there's many, many others. And, I'm a part of another that, has over 100 people in it. And, others that, have, similar numbers of people. And And then, on the other side, so, that's one side of the queer Christian community. And then there's the other side that, does affirm same-sex marriage, that, gets married to the same sex, that dates the same sex. And they also love Jesus and are committed to following him. And their faith is inspiring. I've been to some affirming churches that affirm same-sex marriage that are pastored by queer people, and it's so evident their faith and that the Holy Spirit is in those places, and that again is shocking to people because they think, wait a minute, you affirm same-sex marriage, you're getting married, you're dating the same sex, and you love Jesus, and God is blessing you and the Holy Spirit is, present in your churches. That doesn't sound right. That can't be. But it is. And if you have ever known a queer Christian who is married to the same sex and loves Jesus, I think you'll see it. It's kind of undeniable. And so these things exist. And to what you said, a lot of these communities form online first. A lot of these friendships build in online spaces because it's hard to find people that are like you immediately in churches because you're surrounded by people who for the most part identify as straight, get married to the opposite sex, have a nuclear family, all of these things. And so people kind of find each other through online spaces and build a lot of those connections. I should say several actually of, some of my closest friends I met online through Twitter and Facebook. And I never would have known them otherwise. And now they've become, some of my closest friends. And that speaks to the power of online communities, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, and I want to get there later in our conversation too, because of course we're made digital. We love talking about all things digital and how that is affected or is connected to our faith, our discipleship, our Christian communities, our evangelism, all those big words, but how digital stuff affects us in our faith life. And so I want to get there later, but before we get there, I mean, there's just so many other things, particularly because we're talking about these ways that LGBTQ Christians experience harm. I mean, for one thing, your story surprises me because you stayed. The story I know, and probably most people know of, a queer friend or a family member is if they were in the church when they came out, that also meant they left church. So you stayed, or did you leave and then come back? I'd love to hear a little bit about that and why. Why did you stay?
Yeah, I stayed. I did not leave. I loved Jesus. My faith was very strong and was not in any way under threat when I came out as being queer. In fact, it was really startling to me to actually see people question whether my faith was, under threat. And I was like, why? Why would you think that? It was very strange. And, for me, when I came out, it wasn't, declaring this, raw, I am gay. It was actually, people just figuring it out over time and just asking. And, this, kind of like this cascading event that just kind of rippled out. And, I couldn't necessarily control it. People just figured out over time and, I had to deal with it. And so, other people, eventually come out because, there's just these building stresses and pressures keeping this secret for so long. And, you reach a point where you just can't do it anymore. And you have to come out for your own mental health because the pressure that keeping this secret does to you is just so great and really harmful over time. But yeah, for me, I stayed, and I stayed because I love Jesus. And I think that's kind of the story for most queer people that I know is Our faith is important to us, and most queer people I know would say that their faith is more important than anything else in their life, including their sexuality. And, so they want to they have to figure out a way to, follow Jesus and make their sexuality work in light of their faith. And that is, essential. That is crucial for them. And there are many who do walk away from the faith. And by and large, I think a lot of people see that. I think the assumption for many Christians is often, this stereotype of just rejecting God, rebelling against him, wanting to embrace their sin and live this sexually liberated lifestyle. I've found that to be overwhelmingly not the case. For the vast majority of queer people that I know, the reason why so many walk away is because of how they've been treated. Right. I have one friend who walked away for upwards of 20 years before coming back, and the reason why was because when they approached their pastor to talk to him about, their experiences with same-sex attraction, their experiences, their confusion over gender, their pastor, they asked their pastor, what do I do? And their pastor said, well, you can walk out of this church building and never come back. And so that's what they did. Wow. And so, wow. There's often this assumption that, queer people are leaving as the statement of rebellion, but I've found by and large that, in fact, many queer people leave because they've been pushed out. Another queer friend of mine, when it was discovered that he was gay, he did not come out willingly, but, it was discovered. He was, dragged in front of the church and, made to repent publicly in front of the entire church, made to say that he was living in sin, just for being gay. And, that's traumatizing for people to get up in front of a church of, the entire congregation and say that you are sinful just for who you are. That's traumatizing for people. And so, it's not surprising when people leave the church over that, because, the church is supposed to represent Jesus. And when that is what is being presented to queer people as being Jesus, a lot of people decide that's not what they want. Yeah. It's not go ahead.
Yeah. The statistic that you reference it, I hadn't, it doesn't surprise me, but it's sickening to think about. This religious faith reduces the risk of suicide for virtually every American demographic. Having a faith is a good thing for every demographic except one, LGBTQ people. It increases the risk of suicide. Mm-hmm. So, tell us a little bit about that. I mean, you already are, but it's because what you're saying is because of, if you come out, or if it's a secret too hard to bear. If you come out, you're going to be removed from your church. What's happening here?
Yeah, it's, I share your, I guess, feelings about that statistic. When that study came out, it was, heartbreaking, not surprising, but heartbreaking that religious involvement would reduce suicide for everyone except LGBTQ people, and for those LGBTQ people, it increases. It's not surprising, but it happens over and over and over again, and it's a matter not necessarily of, this one experience is, just such a terrible experience, and so they just decide that life is not worth living and attempt suicide as a result. That it's not just one experience, though, there there are times of, very traumatic experiences, but really it's the buildup over time of experience after experience after experience that just tells you over and over and over again that you are not loved by the people in your life, and you are not loved by God. And that message is sent in a multitude of ways over and over and over again, in little ways, by friends who stop talking to you, and in big ways by, people calling you the F word. And by that, I mean FAG, right. Not FUCK. Yeah. And, that goes on in the church, people assaulting you, Christians assaulting you, and that goes on and is surprisingly common. Sexual abuse is surprisingly common. It's just this build-up again and again and again of experiences that reach a point where you just can't take it anymore. Mm-hmm. And you just can't see how your life can go on this way. Because if this is what your life is, then you don't want to live it. You don't want to live it anymore. And so many people have been brought to the brink of suicide as a result of that. And, for every person that has died by suicide, there are 10 more that have attempted. And for every person that has attempted, there are 100 more that have thought about it, seriously thought about it. And so it's a epidemic, and is sadly, it's not something that is rare for queer people. It is the normative experience for them. It is characteristic of what the experience in church is like for queer people in the church, and it's absolutely tragic.
Well, and the classic scenario of the queer community embracing you, the church rejecting you, the queer community embracing you, and like they talk about family language. Like if your own family has rejected you, your community that you thought was for life, and know that you had the courage to tell people what you're really going through. Yeah. And then you're rejected. And then you find outside of the church a community of people who welcome you, who want to have a holiday dinner with you and a turkey dinner, and who want to, just embrace you, literally, like to have you be part of their community. It's such a contrast. Like the thing that we say church is about is the exact opposite of what they have found. Yeah,
and I can... No, go finish.
Yeah, sorry. No, that's it. Yeah.
Okay. I would say that echoes my own experience. I have found far more meaningful, genuine, life-giving community in queer communities than I've ever found in the church. It's unbelievable how close queer people become, how much queer people rally around each other, support each other. And to that point, within queer Christian communities, I have found more closeness and around the gospel than I've ever found in churches. More of more support for walking with Jesus than I've ever, found within church communities. And, that to me speaks to some problems in general in churches, but it also speaks to me of, you mentioned the word family, of, being so marginalized, being so pushed aside, that queer people, they come together as a family because the family that they have been told for so long that, ought to be there for them, is not. And so there's this concept of chosen family in queer communities that I think really echoes a lot of what we see in Scripture, of this idea that our family is not necessarily biological, though that type of family is important, but our family is one that is unified around Jesus. And I see that echoed in the concept of chosen family in so many queer communities.
Yeah, it's making me think of this. I assume why you called the book Heavy Burdens, Matthew 23. Jesus' woe to religious leaders.
Yep.
I'll just read it here. I'd love to get your insight on this. Jesus is calling out religious leaders, saying, "They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them."
Yeah. I think that, well, to begin with, that is the verse that inspired the title for my book. And yeah, I think that this is kind of the atmosphere in churches, is this constant need to put burdens on queer people and expectations that so many straight Christians and cisgender Christians would never place upon themselves, and aren't really willing to help queer people carry in any way. And, one such example that's kind of the most obvious one is this expectation to either be celibate or to marry the opposite sex, to marry a gender that you're not actually attracted to. And that is a heavy, heavy burden. And it's one that most straight Christians would never, ever put upon themselves. They would never, ever put up with for themselves. And yet it's placed so quickly on queer people without a second thought. And very little is done in churches to create the kind of community that would make something like lifelong celibacy, like lifelong commitment to a spouse that you're not attracted to, possible for queer people. And I say that as someone who is celibate. I say that as someone who is committed to the traditional sexual ethic, while supporting my siblings in Christ who, believe in same-sex marriage and get married to the same sex. For me, I am convicted of the traditional sexual ethic, and so I am celibate. So for me, I say that critique, not really with any other motives than trying to kind of communicate what heavy expectations these are, what heavy burdens these are. And not much is really done in the church to make this easier, to make this feasible. Most of the community in most churches is centered around families, is centered around couples. And very, very little is ever done to create a community that is centered around, not family necessarily, but the spiritual family that we have. And placing that first and creating community that allows people to flourish, even if they don't have a spouse, even if they don't have a nuclear family to anchor them. And I think that's a huge problem. And honestly, it's only one example. My book talks, seven burdens I go through, and even those 7 burdens are only 7 things that I pull out. I could keep going. But, I named those 7 because I think they're a good starting point for a lot of people.
Yeah, I would like to get to some more of these, but what struck me about this, I'm a single person, and you write about the idea that, and you're speaking now, that like if you come out as queer, you say, hey, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I'm whatever, LGBTQ, suddenly everyone wants to know your sexual history, are you celibate right now? And by everyone, maybe not everyone, but there's either a subtle curiosity or an outright investigation around your sexual life.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm a single adult in my 30s, and I would say I am never questioned on that issue. Maybe a few times in my whole life have people actually directly asked me about those things. If they're, I don't know, not like a close friend. I mean, like people in sort of a religious authority over me. It's not something that we really talk about, but it's just interesting. As a contrast, I'm also a single and celibate adult, but because I'm attracted to the opposite gender, I'm not really asked about it.
Yeah.
And actually, I probably never on this podcast have had to say those words. I've never had to talk about it.
Yeah.
But you do. You have to talk about it within the first 5 minutes of us meeting each other. You were saying those kinds of things to us on this conversation.
Yeah. And I think, what you said about how, these things do come up, but they come up with close friends in the context of like, not super heavy conversations where you can just kind of sit back, talk about these things and not feel intimidated with close friends, or in the context of, groups that you actually seek out,
Right.
Accountability groups, that kind of thing that you actually seek out. These I guess, encounters where people just want to come up to you or send you emails asking you these very invasive questions, people that aren't even close to you. It's not very common for most people. And it's something that happens almost immediately to queer people, almost like assumed that the minute you come out as gay, people have a right to pry into the most personal aspects of your life and speak into it. I remember there was one time when I posted something on Facebook for National Coming Out Day. This was a past year, not this past year. And I posted something for National Coming Out Day, and a woman sent me a direct message who I have not seen in over a decade, and who knows nothing about who I am, and yet felt the need to send me a DM, long letter, making first assumptions about my sex life, and second, demanding information from me about my sex life. And I think people, assume, well, you made this statement about being gay, so now it's free reign, and I can demand whatever information I want. But when people come out as gay, as queer, as any identity in the LGBTQ spectrum, it's not a statement of sexual activity as much as it is a statement of, this is an experience that I have, and I want to share it with you. I don't want to keep this secret anymore. I can't keep this secret anymore. And wanting to come out in order to just kind of, tell people, look, this is part of my life. It's important to me, but it's not an invitation to, start prying. And, for most people that I know, they're not trying to talk about their sexual activity. A lot of, for Christians, a lot of Christians that are queer, choose celibacy actually. And that's their life path. And so actually their sexual activity has nothing to do with telling people that they're queer. And so I think that's important for people to realize.
You're talking a lot about in this idea of the heavy burden and how to live as a celibate person. It's made me think a lot about Catholic traditions, and as a single person myself, I've learned a little bit about what nuns and priests do in terms of how they set up these celibate single people in a family, and then even actually take care of you to death. If you commit your life to the church, the basic idea is that they take care of you. They provide a home. They provide a community. There is literally, like, when you're retired, there is a place you can go live with other nuns or other, retired priests and have support, family, financial care, all those things that you need and often get from a family unit and a spouse. And it's just, I bring it up because you talk about your website as Meditations of a Traveling Nun. Do you identify with that kind of a lifestyle at all? Maybe you know more about it than I do, but that's my initial research into it.
Yeah, I definitely have found a lot of affinity for just kind of the Catholic approach to a lot of these questions, just in terms of the rich history that is there, and like you said, this I guess willingness to kind of provide for those communities and create community, and also just the willingness to celebrate that. Whereas in most Protestant churches, I think that it's seen as this kind of sad, pitiful thing. Oh, you're celibate, you're single, you kind of feel bad for them, or see it as like they haven't yet, matured.
There's something wrong. Well, there's certainly something wrong with you, right?
Yeah. Whereas this thing, there's a rich history within Catholicism of celebrating this and seeing it as, an admirable thing. And I definitely find a lot of affinity for that, and, a lot of desire to see some of that cross over into Protestantism. And when I created my blog, I named it Meditations of a Traveling Nun. And there was definitely a lot of those feelings, feeling as if a lot of my life commitments kind of were echoes of that. And the traveling part was, to, I guess, the feeling that this was a journey, this was an ongoing process, and I'm just kind of working through this as I travel this path. And believe it or not, I came up with that name before I had necessarily even realized that I was gay. And, back when I was still very closeted, even to myself. And yet, even during that time, I, as a single person who was never attracted to men ever in my life, was feeling as if, gosh, this might be my life. And if that's the case, I got to figure out a way to make this work for me. And so I think that kind of speaks to how, even outside of the queer community, I think a lot of single women and even single men find themselves in a place of, really thinking, well, this might be actually a lifelong thing if I don't find anyone. And I think that's important to acknowledge also, is just that reality that this isn't just something the queer community needs. This is something the whole church needs.
Right. Well, it's this idea, back to that Matthew 23 text about the heavy burden. They put this heavy burden on the shoulders, but aren't willing to lift a finger themselves. Like, okay, so for different reasons, if you and I are called in a sexual ethic of, traditional church to be celibate, then like, how will you help bring how will we be part of family? How will we have care when we're elderly? Even some financial support that usually families provide to do with your particularly in the elder years of your life. And I do think there's a better model, perhaps. Nothing perfect. It's not idealized, but maybe there is a better model in the Catholic Church. The Protestant Church and the Evangelical Church certainly is around this like family, like literally whether the organization or not focus on the family. Like it's all about the family unit. And of course, more and more adults, whatever their orientation, more and more adults are single. Or are single longer into adulthood, or are choosing not to have children, or are unable to have children, And so there's all these ways we live, but yet like there is sort of this idealized way. And Jesus himself was a single guy. So like there is a way to live a full, rich life as a single or a celibate person.
Yeah, and I think of the early church when it comes to this, and I think the early church, modeled this sense of creating community and supporting people to be committed to God's vision and calling for their life. Like following Jesus is not a thing that can be done by yourself. And people in Protestant and evangelical churches say that a lot, like we need the church, we need community. But the reality is that not much is actually put in to actually supporting people in that. What that means is basically you have to go to church every Sunday, go to a small group, and show up to potlucks every once in a while. And that's not actually what that means. Like, that is not supporting people in a community in any kind of way. To what you mentioned about real life things, like supporting people financially and providing things like housing and, actual like placing people within communities where, they're living together with other people, like just very practical, kind of obvious things that the early church did for everyone and that are just missing now. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, to move on from there, I'd love to know more of, there's, as you say, there's 7 things you name in your book. There's so many more we could talk about, but bring to the surface some of these other ideas that you bring up in the book. Tell us a few more of these burdens or the ways that LGBTQ Christians are experiencing harm. So we've just talked about this burden of unveiling your sexual history and having to be alone maybe your whole life without any support system or family. What are some other things that are part of this list for you?
Yeah, another big one is the ways in which so many Christians really pair what it means to be queer with essentially sin. And you hear this often, Christians, when someone comes out, like, why would you come out? Like, why would you, Christians will say, why would you pair your Christian identity with your sinful nature? As if what it means to be queer is to be sinful. And it's like, why? Why do we do that? And I think that just speaks to the ways in which so many Christians have stigmatized what it means to be queer. And basically making it synonymous with sin. We're basically saying that what it means to be this kind of person is it means that you are sinful. And that is just so harmful to so many people. And, creates this situation where when many of my friends have come out, I'll see people respond with, you can't be gay and Christian. Like it's an oxymoron. Right. And that creates this, sense in which, God doesn't want gay people in the church. And it functions to push people away. Like, oh, I can't be a Christian? Well, what's the conclusion that a lot of people are going to make? They're not going to even try because all of these Christians are saying that actually God doesn't want them in the church. And so it's so harmful to so many people. And I think another way, and I go into this in the book and talk about it a lot, there's, such a, like so much of this conversation is caught up in the culture wars. And it's been a very politicized topic. And really it's used as a weapon in politics to get people to come out for, to vote for certain people and to be aligned with certain political positions. And it becomes very harmful because people no longer think of this as, a matter of loving people. People think of this as, oh, this entire group of people is against the church in fundamental ways that threaten its very existence. And in order to protect the church against these people, I have to vote in a certain way. I have to support certain candidates, support certain platforms. Otherwise, these people are going to take over and, threaten
these people.
Yes, these people. And it's extremely harmful. And it's just not true. It's not representative of the reality of what it means to be queer. And most queer people that I know just want to be left alone and just want to live their life and are so often not allowed to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have any, I don't know if you've watched it or chosen not to watch it, Pray Away, the film on Netflix about conversion therapy? I imagine you get asked about it, but I don't know if you want to comment on it.
Yeah, I have not watched it yet. It's on my list of things that I am wanting to watch as soon as possible. And yeah, I'm excited that has come out because I think that conversion therapy does not get a lot of attention. And it's a big issue right now because there's a lot of the sense that I see among Christians that this is a matter of Christian freedom. And, conversion therapy has to be legal because people should follow their religious conscience. And so people should be free to choose this. Therapists should be free to practice this. But a lot of people don't realize that conversion therapy has been shown to increase the risk of suicide by as much as 500%. Like, this is a therapy that, really kills people. And that's never talked about. And, it's like when you are supporting this as, a issue of religious liberty, you are basically supporting a form of therapy that
is it very therapeutic?
That results in people's death. And, just to kind of compare it to, past things that maybe put this in perspective. There are many practices that we no longer do and consider, in fact, abusive today. For example, letting blood or bloodletting. Like 300 years ago, people believed that if you attached leeches to your skin and they sucked out your blood, that would somehow heal whatever ailment you had. If a doctor did that today, it would be considered medical malpractice. You could sue that doctor for his life. Like, that is not okay. And it is not a matter of, political freedom it's not a civil right to be able to choose that, like, that's not something that should be on the table to be chosen. It's very like that is a practice that actually kills people. And, you put it in those terms and people are like, well, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But suddenly when we're talking about a therapeutic practice that kills people, it's not as clear to people. But the studies show that this increases the risk of suicide by astronomical amounts. And it really cannot go on because it really is a practice that is killing people.
Right. Well, and it's based on a premise that you can, through therapy, not be gay anymore. That's the basic premise is, well, the basic idea is there's some harm, trauma, broken thinking, sinful piece of your life that if we could heal that, your father issue or whatever it is, then you won't have same-sex attraction or whatever. Yeah. And ultimately we have now a lot of data that seems to indicate that's just not how it goes for most people. Yeah. So I guess there are some people, I guess, who say they're gay and then later say they're not or something. I guess there are some people that is true for, but the general trend and the statistics seem to indicate that conversion therapy is not actually changing anyone. It's harming people. Yeah.
And a lot of Christians, it's always ironic to me, and this is one thing that I also talk about in Heavy Burdens, because a lot of Christians don't realize that conversion therapy is based upon Freudian psychology. It's Freudian from start to finish, and it's so ironic because the way I was taught in my evangelical church, Freudian psychology was evil. It was part of the whole problem with the ways in which our culture is sex saturated and obsessed with sexuality and all the bad things. And yet, conversion therapy is Freudian. If it wasn't for Freud, conversion therapy would not exist. And you actually read the major leaders of it, they base all of their methods on what Freud had to say about homosexuality and about sexuality in general. And people don't realize that. But from start to finish, it's Freudian.
Yeah. I mean, when you say it, that makes sense. I'm now connecting those dots in my head from my, basic university studies of Freud. I don't have an expertise in it, but the place I want to get to before we end our conversation, this is a conversation that can't solve all these issues. I'm sure some people listening are wrestling with some new ideas just in general, but I want to touch on the idea of the digital world and how it's affected this conversation. Meaning, for example, you're finding community online of people to talk. When you didn't find people in your own church community, you were able to find people online. I'm thinking about, we're just talking about a Netflix film, like a streaming video that's accessible to the world that kind of brings this conversation and concern about conversion therapy to the surface. There's these digital tools, resources, education. There's the spin out of control of, various conspiracy theories of all kinds. But just broadly, what do you think the digital world has done, or for positive or for negative, to the conversation? Do you think it's helping people feel more open, more paranoid?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's been a positive thing. I think that it's connected queer Christians to each other in a way that we've never been connected. And I think, in the past, there was really not many ways to connect. If you stayed in the church, it was a lonely road, and it was hard to find anyone who was like you, because, most churches are made up of, straight peoples, just straight people and families, heterosexual nuclear families. And so it's extremely hard to find community when you don't have the internet, when you don't have social media to connect people. And so, the ways in which this conversation has benefited are just astronomical. And I think, people go online and they see, a lot of, I guess, homophobic people who are spouting a lot of toxic thinking or attacking gay people for XYZ. And my thoughts are that has been going on forever. That has been the norm forever, but now it's finally out there. Now people can finally see it and see what people say to LGBTQ people on full display. And in the process of that, queer people are connecting with each other, or finding each other and becoming friends and joining online communities and, building these networks. And I really, believe that my book, Heavy Burdens, wouldn't be possible apart from the online communities that exist and the conversations that have been happening there. The Side B community largely developed out of an online forum and conversations on there that happened that ultimately led to the creation of this, community of people that are are centered around Jesus and centered around the gospel and want to support each other. And, similarly with, when I say side B, I should define that. Side B being queer Christians that follow the traditional sexual ethic, and similar to that for queer Christians that follow the, affirming sexual ethic, affirming same-sex marriage. Similar, that conversation has developed so much and become possible because of online communities, because of, forums in the early 2000s, and then Facebook, and then Twitter, and Instagram, and, now TikTok and Discord and all these places. Wow. It's fostering this conversation and connecting people in ways that just would have never been possible otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, it has changed. And I think that's too, for, why on this podcast we're always talking about it, because it has changed how church works, how theological thought is happening, how people are talking and thinking about their faith, finding their community, finding a church community or a Christian community. We keep sort of asking the question here because it affects every part of it. We talk about digital is the water we're swimming in, so it's affecting every part of our life.
And one more just thought on that is, I think a big thing is people are watching this conversation now, and people are being exposed to it in a way that they wouldn't have been exposed otherwise. They never would have, seen the arguments being put out there and being made and discussed and talked about, because in the past, those types of things happened behind closed doors. They didn't happen in a way that was accessible to a lot of people. Yeah. Now it's happening publicly. Now people, see it happening everywhere on their social media feeds, when they go on Twitter, when they, go on, this other social media. And because of that, now people are asking questions. I'm sorry, that was my dog. Now people are asking, now people are asking questions and wanting to know more. And so, it's changing a lot of things that would not have changed otherwise. And so, 100%, it's been truly transformative.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Bridget, if people want to find you, they want to find your book. You've referenced some other things, other resources or communities. Where do you want to send people today to find all of this stuff? So my book is available wherever books are sold. Go to your favorite publisher. Just search Heavy Burdens by Bridget Eileen Rivera and you'll find it. And, my website is bridgeteileenrivera.com. You can access it there and find, all of my stuff there. And my social media handle is Traveling Nun. And so you can follow me on, social media. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, Facebook, all of those different places. And so feel free to follow me on social media. We can connect that way. And, feel free to search. Feel free to search for my book on any website and go ahead and give it a purchase. Awesome. Yeah. Bridget, thank you so much. It's a conversation that, to be continued. We need to keep having these conversations. It's important. So I'm grateful for you, giving some time to us today here at We're Made Digital. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.